There we go. Because my intention is that I'll make the recording available to any of you who want to rewatch it later, because there's a lot of content here.
Good.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you right up front, I'm really nervous about doing this tonight. And I think you all know that I love to teach, but normally when I teach something, it's something I know really, really well. And I'm not an expert on Photoshop, so I need to put that right out there now. I'm sort of an advanced beginner in Photoshop, but I know that I'm good at explaining things and helping people understand how things work. So that's why I decided to offer this tonight. And undoubtedly, there are some of you who know more about certain aspects of Photoshop than I do. And that's okay. You know, if I get stuck, I'll just turn things over to you. So I'm going to share my screen now and hope that I can still let people in if they arrive late. And you should be seeing my introductory slide there.
Yeah.
I really mean this is an absolute beginner's introduction. So if you've used Photoshop before, this may fill in some gaps for you or clarify some things for you. If you've never used Photoshop, my hope is that it will help you decide whether you want to or not, and give you the confidence to go ahead and play with it if you do want to. Photoshop is really old technology. It's 34 years old, and it's never been rebuilt from the ground up. And anytime you have software that is that old, each revision builds on to what was done before, and you end up with what's called bloatware. Because the old code stays in it. And so that's a disadvantage to Photoshop, is that it just doesn't, it's got a lot of stuff in it that doesn't need to be in it and can slow it down. And I do need to let somebody in here, I think. Bear with me, guys. There's Jackie. Okay, that's how we do that. All right, I'll put that over there. It also was designed to be sort of a do everything program originally, and was very much used by graphic designers who use a lot of things that we will never use as photographers. So the program itself is very, very big and very, very complex, and you literally could spend the rest of your life learning Photoshop, and maybe I will, who knows. There are alternatives to Photoshop out there, and some of them that are pretty decent alternatives are Affinity Photo. There's another person. How do I let them in? I can't see them. Affinity Photo is a British product that has come around in the last, I would guess, 5 years or so. And so it doesn't have the bloatware. It is almost as powerful as Photoshop for what a photographer would want, but it doesn't include all the graphic design stuff that Photoshop does. They have a separate program for designers, and then a separate program for like newsletter publishers. We use it to publish our club newsletter. So Affinity Photo is one, and it's well under $100 and often goes on sale for even half price. On One Photo is another option that's very, very good. I used to use On One a lot. I don't use it a lot anymore. Luminar is another one. Topaz Studio is another one, which I think is free. And Photoshop Elements is another option. Now, all of those programs use layers. And that's one of the huge advantages of Photoshop, is the layers. And you're going to learn about layers tonight. But those are all perfectly acceptable alternatives. The only caveat I have with that is that Photoshop Elements is 8-bit only. It will not do 16-bit. And we'll get in a minute to why that's important. Just referring to my outline here, so keep me on track. Any of the principles that you learn tonight are going to be applicable to all of those programs. So if you decide you don't want to use Lightroom, you'd rather use Affinity or On One or whatever, the principles that you learn tonight will translate over. The specific keystrokes and stuff may not, but in some cases they do actually. One of the advantages of Photoshop, aside from its power, is that there are lots and lots of tutorials out there. So if you run into a snag when you're working in Photoshop, you go to YouTube and look it up, and you'll almost certainly find an answer. Another advantage is that if you use Lightroom, then you already have Photoshop. If you're using anything past Lightroom, newer than Lightroom 6, because the subscription includes both programs. So you already have it, so no more money to put out. There are also a lot of plugins that can be used in Photoshop, but can't be used in other programs. And I use one of those, which I may get around to showing you tonight. Pardon me. There are also actions out there which automate some of the things that you might do in Photoshop. And there are brushes, because you can do painting in Photoshop, and there are thousands of brushes out there for Photoshop, some of which can be used in Affinity as well. So I'm not here to sell you on Photoshop. I resisted it for a long time. And finally, I bit the bullet and said, well, I'll subscribe for a year. And that was about 2 years ago. And I just keep at it because mostly because I really like Lightroom, and I don't want to lose Lightroom, which I would lose if I stopped subscribing. You need to understand the difference between destructive and non-destructive editing. Lightroom gives you non-destructive editing, which I think is a big advantage, and Photoshop gives you destructive editing. And what that means is that when you edit a photograph, if you do it in Lightroom, Lightroom doesn't change your original file. If it's a raw file or a JPEG, whatever it is, Lightroom doesn't do anything to that file. It simply writes another file called a sidecar, which keeps track of all the changes you did. And when you click on that photo, it applies those changes so you can see it. And then when you export the photo, it bakes those changes into the exported version, but your original photo is not altered in any way. And that's really valuable. Whereas if you open something in Photoshop and you start doing things to it, those changes are baked in. And there's a way to have the best of both worlds, which we'll get to in a minute. If you are starting from Lightroom, and I pretty much always go to Photoshop from within Lightroom. And if you're starting and you're new at Lightroom, or if you're not even sure kind of how things work all that well in Lightroom, then I would suggest you go to my YouTube channel and look up the file management in Lightroom tutorial that I did there. And that will help you understand how Lightroom works. One of the things we want to talk about, actually, I need to show you my outline. This is what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about shooting for Photoshop, because it starts with your camera. We've already talked about Lightroom and Photoshop. ACR, or Adobe Camera Raw, is an engine for editing raw files that is built into Lightroom, and it also is available in Photoshop. I like it in Lightroom because it's built right in and I don't have to think about it. Also, Lightroom is a little bit more powerful and a little bit more intuitive to use than Adobe Camera Raw. But if you don't want to use Lightroom for some reason, and I can't figure out why anybody would not want to, but if you don't, you can use Adobe Camera Raw, which does very similar things right in Photoshop. We're going to talk about layers and masks tonight. We're going to talk about how to get rid of distractions or clean up your composition, get rid of the trash can in the corner and the Coke can on the ground, that sort of thing. We're going to talk about selections and adjustment layers and cropping, and then some resources for further learning. And if we can't get through all of this tonight, then I will almost certainly offer a part 2. This is a lot of material, and this is the first time I've presented it, so there may be more than we can cover tonight. Okay, let's talk about 8-bit versus 16-bit. When you set up your camera, you can adjust the settings so that you're shooting JPEG or RAW, or both, and I hope you're shooting RAW. You may want to shoot both if you do a lot of posting online, but even if you don't post-process now, there will come a day, I predict, when you will wish you had the raw files, because you'll know more than you do. And the software in the future will be more powerful than what we have now. I have JPEG files from trips I've taken, and I so wish I had raw files because I could do so much more with them. You also want to set up your camera to shoot a color profile of Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB, but not sRGB. sRGB is intended only for screens, and it captures much less information. So if you want a print made from something and you shot it in sRGB, you're not going to get as nice a print. So you want to maximize the quality coming out of your camera in order to take advantage of all the technology that's available to you in post. So raw, Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB, and yeah, that's the main thing. 16-bit versus 8-bit. When you have an 8-bit photograph, an 8-bit file, it has 256 brightness levels in it. By the way, if you want to take screenshots of this stuff, feel free. If you're on a Mac, I know that pressing Command-Shift-3 will screenshot the entire screen, and pressing Command-Shift-4 will give you a little crosshairs that you can drag to copy the part of the screen you want. So feel free to take some screenshots instead of taking notes if you like, or in addition to whatever. So you've got 856 brightness or tones in an 8-bit file, but you have 65,536 brightness levels in a 16-bit. So you can see that there's a huge advantage in having all that tonal information in a 16-bit file. You get 16 million colors in 8-bit, which seems like a lot, but you get 28 billion colors in 16-bit. So again, a significant difference. In 8-bit, you'll often find some banding and artifacts in the sky. So your sky might look like maybe 17 different bands of blue in different shades, whereas in a 16-bit file, it will look absolutely smooth in gradation, like the sky really is. 8-bit does have the advantage of giving you smaller file sizes, but that's hardly a consideration these days if you're really serious about taking good photographs, and hard drives are pretty cheap these days. Be aware that JPEGs are always 8-bit. So if you're only shooting JPEG, you're only getting that left-hand column there. And Photoshop Elements is 8-bit only, which is the reason I don't use Photoshop Elements. It's actually a very capable program and can do a lot of the things I would want it to do. But because I would be throwing away all those tones and all those colors and things, I don't want to use Elements. The other programs I mentioned are capable of dealing with 16-bit files, so they are worthwhile considerations. When you're working in 16-bit, you can save your file as a TIFF file or a Photoshop document, PSD file, to preserve the details and the layers. You can also export a JPEG, even a low resolution JPEG, to put on Facebook or whatever. So you're not limited that way. Okay, from
Judy.
Yes.
I have one question. So what
Sure.
about our phones? You know, when we shoot a picture with our phones, what are they, 8-bit or 16-bit?
That's a really good question, and I don't know. I think it probably depends on the age of your phone, but if I'm honest, I don't know whether any of the phones shoot 16-bit.
Okay.
Do any of you guys know?
Most phones,
No, I don't know.
yeah, most phones shoot in JPEG only, so I would assume they're 8-bit.
Okay, I do know that the newer Apple phones, the iPhones, shoot in RAW. So
Yeah.
that's why I'm waiting until the fall when the new iPhone is announced, and I'll get one then, because I want to be able to shoot RAW, but I don't know if it's 16-bit.
Yeah, you can buy a program as well that will shoot I know for Apple anyway, that will make it so you can shoot in RAW, but
It's an app, though, isn't it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's an app or something you add to.
Yeah, it's an app. You have to buy the app.
Yep, got it. Thank you.
Okay, and feel free to interrupt me if you're confused on something. Now I want to talk about opening, and you're going to see this a number of times tonight, opening from Lightroom. When you open a file you're in Lightroom and you want to edit something in Photoshop. I'll show you the route to that. But what happens is it will give you the option to edit a copy with the Lightroom changes you've already made. And that's normally what I do. So I take that into Photoshop and I make my adjustments and things, and then I save it in Photoshop, and it automatically puts that Photoshop edited file back into Lightroom. I don't have to put it in manually afterwards. It automatically goes back, which is really nice. And it, depending on how your preferences are set, it will stack it with the original file. So they're all together, and that can be very handy. If you open straight, if you take a raw file, for example, or a raw file, and you drag it straight from your folder on your desktop into Photoshop, it will actually, rather than opening Photoshop right away, it will open Adobe Camera Raw. And that will give you a chance to do your basic raw adjustments. And then you can either send that file into Photoshop to work on it some more, or you can send it to Photoshop as a smart object. And we're going to talk about smart objects a little bit later. The difference is you can go back, if it's a smart object, you can go back and change the adjustments you made in Adobe Camera Raw. And if it's not a smart object, you can't do that. So in Lightroom, I typically use the sliders that you see over here. If I go to the develop module, I typically do a bunch of adjustments in Lightroom. And actually, until the last just few months, I've done 95% of my work in Lightroom. If I don't have to use Photoshop, I don't. And one of the things I do right away in Lightroom is I will check on these lens corrections so that it will remove any chromatic aberration, that's purple and green fringing. And we can enable the profile correction so that if you're shooting like with a wide angle lens and it distorts things, this will automatically fix the distortion. To some extent, it's limited. Yeah. Folks, you might want to mute yourselves until you want to ask a question, just to avoid some background noise. And then I go into basics and I do some basic adjustments in here with exposure, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, texture perhaps. And as I say, 95% of the time I used to just stop there and you know that I've been very successful with my work. So often you don't need Photoshop, but sometimes I will go in and use Photoshop. Okay. I also in Lightroom, I will level my horizons. That's one of my pet peeves is unlevel horizons. And I just do that by clicking on this, and you can drag a level line, or you can just move the angle like this. And if you don't like what you did, you just go back, double click the slider and it'll go back to the way you started. And I don't crop yet. And I don't crop in Photoshop normally, but I will show you one exception. And I tend to do my cropping last. I really try to shoot the photo as I want it in camera. There might be situations where I'd crop here and then go to Photoshop, but I don't want to throw any pixels away. I want all my pixels there to work on until I'm ready to actually export a file to be put on Facebook or printed or whatever. Okay. So layers, what are layers? Let's talk about layers. Some of you might be old enough to remember this machine. I certainly am. I used this many, many, many times when I was teaching. The old overhead projectors, you would use a sheet of acetate, clear acetate, and the teacher might put that acetate on the machine and then write on it. Or they might, like you see up here, projected the word bacteria and these squares. They might have something printed onto an overhead, onto an acetate sheet, a transparency we used to call them, to put on the overhead projector. And if you wanted to add something to it, you could get another piece of acetate and write something else on that and lay it on top of the first piece of acetate, and then you would see what was on both. And this is the best analogy I have for you of how layers work in Photoshop. Your original image is the bottom layer, and then anything you do to that in Photoshop afterwards is like laying another transparency on top. Sometimes it might be text or something like that, and other times it might be an adjustment. So here's an example of a shot that I took. And if we go into Photoshop, and I'm gonna have to make this a little smaller to get at my controls. If I go to photo, edit in, and I've had a lot of glitches with Adobe Photoshop 2021, so I'm going back to 2020. That's what I'm using. I can show you what the layers might do in a file like this, and I'm going to edit the original. Now, normally, if I'm actually doing photo editing, I don't edit my original, I edit a copy, but you'll see why in a minute, because I've already done the layers in this to show you. So Photoshop starts up. And here you can see over here. Now I keep my layers on this side. When you first start Photoshop, it will probably come up with this layer panel and these adjustment panels over here on this side. And you can drag it to place it where you want it. This happens to be where I like it. And you won't see this, which is a plugin called Lumenzia, which if we have time, I'll show you what that does tonight. It's pretty amazing what it does. So here's my, this layer down here. If I click on it, it turns blue and I get these little corners around it. And that tells me that that layer is active. And the eyeball tells me that that layer is visible. I have 3 other layers that are invisible at the moment because there's no eyeball beside them. But I can put another layer on top of this to add some text. So when you're getting ready for the, some of the themed things we had, like inspiration last time at the club, this is one way that you could add text. And then I could add another layer of text on top of it. And if I decide to get my move tool, I can move this around and it moves independently of this because it's on different layers. So there's an advantage of layers. So the picture is one layer, the red text is another layer, this is another layer. And then I added another layer where I just painted with a brush onto the next layer. So think of this like transparencies that are layered one on top of another, like an overhead projector. Is that fairly clear? When you add a new layer, it goes on top of the active layer. So if I added a layer now, this is the active layer and it would appear above it. If I make this the active layer, then it'll go above that. So if I, for example, if I add a black and white adjustment layer there, it's not going to do anything because my original picture was already black and white, right? And anything else that's in color is above that layer, so it's not going to be affected. But if I move the black and white layer up here, if I can get it to go, then it turned that layer's colors gray. If I move it up here, then it makes that layer gray. And if I move it to the top, then it makes everything gray, except it didn't move. There we go. So that's how layers work. I'm going to get rid of that one because we're not actually using it. Normally when I'm working, I will bring my photo in, and before I do anything to it, I will copy this. I'll duplicate this layer, my base layer, my photograph, because remember what I said, that Photoshop is destructive, and anything I do will it will alter my original file. So it's, as a safety measure, I'll often duplicate this layer, and the shortcut for that is Command on a Mac, Control on a PC, J. And that makes another copy of it. And then I'll often turn the original one off and just work with this. And then when I get it where I want it and I know I don't need to worry about losing anything on this layer, then I might delete one of these because it will reduce my file size. What else do we need to know about layers? There are pixel layers and there are adjustment layers. So when I did the text and the painting, those are pixel layers. They're made up of actual pixels on the layer. Okay, so this would be like your pen on an overhead transparency. But there are also adjustment layers. And these things here are all different kinds of adjustments. So I could add a black and white adjustment, as I did a minute ago. I could add a hue and saturation adjustment. If I make the top layer active and then add a hue and saturation layer, then I can take the saturation way up or way down, and it will affect that layer. Now, these are pretty saturated colors anyway, so they're probably not going to make any difference. I could also shift the hue. And this gets to be kind of fun, folks. And I can affect the lightness of the entire layer. So these ones are pixel layers where there's actually stuff on the photograph, and the adjustment layers just overlay an adjustment onto it. So this is where the overhead transparency analogy kind of breaks down. Any questions on that? If so, unmute yourself and ask. You can hide or show layers by turning the eyeball off and on. You can merge layers together, but I hesitate to do that because once you take two layers and merge them together, they are merged for good. You can't unmerge them afterwards. So I typically don't merge layers. Okay, so let's talk about masks. And I have a different photo to go for that. So I'm going to close this. I'm in Photoshop. I'm going to close this. It will ask me if I want to save my document, if I've been working on it. I don't want to in this case, so I will say no, but often you'll say yes, you do want to save it. Okay, back in here, we're going to talk about masks. Now, this is one of the things that I found most difficult to understand when I started using Photoshop. And I think the problem is that they use the old back in the day technology from graphic design and just applied it to this new technology 34 years ago, before we really understood a lot of technology the way we do today. And so the terminology doesn't fit unless you used to use that old technology. If you go into Photoshop and you start, let's say we want to get rid of something. If you start erasing it with an eraser, you lose those pixels forever. They are gone. I'm going to take this into Photoshop so I can demonstrate what I'm talking about here. So photo, edit in Photoshop 2020. And I want to edit it as a TIFF file. I want to use ProPhoto RGB, although you could use Adobe RGB, but I would stay away from sRGB because, as you saw before, you lose information that way. 16 bits. Usually I leave this on 300 and no compression. So I'm going to edit my original actually, because I'm not going to change. Oh, okay. Good teaching point. The reason it won't let me edit the original is because, let me see, let's go back here. I'm going to cancel that. Look at this. It's a DNG file, which is a kind of raw file. If you're opening a raw file from Lightroom into Photoshop, it won't let you, from Lightroom change the original, because Lightroom is non-destructive. It doesn't want to mess up your original raw file. So that's why I got that message. So let's do this again. Edit in Adobe Photoshop, and I will choose to edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments. I almost never choose edit a copy. It's either the original, which is rare, or the copy with adjustments. So edit. Now, again, I need to be able to see things here. Okay. So here we have a very mediocre photograph, but I think it'll serve to illustrate. So if we add a layer, which is this little square with a plus sign in it, it comes in as a transparent layer. So that's that sheet of clear acetate that we're laying on top. And if we do something, if we go in here and erase something, like let's say we wanted to erase this bucket. If I go and get, I'm going to duplicate this because I don't want to mess it up. Turn it off. If I go and get the eraser, which is there, and I go in and take that bucket away, oops, I need a bigger eraser. Look what's happening. Underneath is just transparent. And once I erase those, if I press Command Z, I can undo that, right? But once you erase pixels, they are gone and there's no getting them back. So I never use the eraser. And I have said to friends of mine, you are not allowed to use the eraser in Photoshop because it is destructive and you can get into trouble. And there's so much better ways to do this sort of thing. If you put a mask on, let's say we're going to add, I'm going to take this one away, just delete that. Let's say we want to make everything in the picture black and white except the red bucket. So we add a black and white adjustment layer. Now everything's black and white. If I want to make the bucket red, I can work on the mask. So this is the adjustment over here, and this thing is a mask. And when you do an adjustment, it comes with a mask. Now, the thing about masking, you can almost think about it when you are painting a house and you come to a window. I don't know about you, but I'm not good enough with a paintbrush to not get paint all over the window. So I would use masking tape to mask off the part of the window where I don't want the paint to be. And that's exactly what you're doing with masking here. So think of it almost like masking tape. So here we have a black and white layer and there's no masking tape on it, okay? It's white. So that adjustment applies to everything. If we want to mask this effect off part of the picture, we can paint on the mask. Now, right now, the adjustment is live because it's got these corners on it. And the mask is not live. If I click on the mask, it becomes active. And now I can paint on the mask to reveal this red bucket. So I'm not erasing. What I'm going to do is, we know that everything that's white on the mask is showing the effect. So we need to paint black where we don't want the effect to be. So I'm going to grab a paintbrush. I'm going to make sure my foreground color is black. This is foreground color and background color. And I'm just going to go over it, making sure I'm on the mask. And I'm just going to start painting. Now, I've got this set for an opacity of 15%. So this is handy if you want to be subtle about transitions and things. But if I want to paint that bucket in completely, I can just start painting here and that bucket comes back. What it's doing is it's removing the effect from that part. So if I option click the mask, I can show you. This is the black part. It's the piece of masking tape that you put over something to prevent the paint from slopping onto the window. That's the best analogy I can give you. So anything that's black is not going to have the effect applied to it. And anything that's white is going to have the effect applied to it. Any questions on that? What else have I got to tell you about? If you find that there's different colors over here, that it's not black and white, being on the paintbrush and pressing D will reset those colors to the defaults, which are black and white. And I'll show you another thing to do this. I'm gonna reset this mask. I'm just going to take a white paintbrush, switch the order here, make the white one on top, and then paint with white over that. So I've taken that away. And so what's going to happen when we look at the picture now? We've removed the white, black and white adjustment layer, so that bucket should be red again. And if I option click the mask to get back to seeing the picture, that's exactly what's happened. That's not red anymore. Another way to do this would be on the pixel layer to select the bucket and then go to the mask and paint. And if I paint while the bucket is selected, oops, that's not what I meant to do. I can paint very broadly. Watch this. Oops, wrong tool, brush. Here I'm painting. Oh, I know what I did, folks. My mistake. Let's go back in here and select the bucket. And we're going to talk about selections again in a minute. There's my bucket. Now I go to the mask. And if I start painting on the mask where the outside of the selection, I did it again. Get my brush, paint on the mask, outside the selection, nothing happens. Anything that I do with the selection in place only applies to the selection. So I can be really sloppy in painting in that bucket because the marching ants, as we call them, the selection things, they act like a fence and keep what I'm doing inside there. If I wanted to, it's going to back up. If I wanted to do everything except the bucket in color, I could invert the selection by going to select inverse. Now everything is selected except the bucket. And if I start painting on my mask with black, everything is going to be affected. But when I go over that bucket, it doesn't turn red. And when we look at this mask, we can see that my black paint will go anywhere I want except on the non-selected area. So, and if I Command D is the shortcut for deselecting. You can also go here to deselect. You can see that the selection wasn't perfect, so there's a bit of red showing there. If I go to the mask, I can actually select the entire mask by Command A is select all, or you can do it by select all up here. And then I could fill the mask with white. Go to Edit, Fill, Fill with white. And now my mask is completely white. That means that the black and white effect applies to everything. Okay. Adjustment layers, these things here, the things that affect the effects on your picture, like exposure, color, that sort of thing, they always come with a mask. You'll notice there's no mask here. And if we were to go to this layer and say, move this out of alignment, well, let me do that, maybe not. I'll have to show you that in another place. Okay, converting mask. And the way you check your mask is to hold down the Option key, Alt on a PC, and click the mask, and it will show you the mask. And then Option, click again to get back to your actual photograph. I can turn that off to get back to my color. Okay, now there's a thing called a clipping mask. And if masks drove me crazy, clipping masks really drove me crazy. And the way to think about a clipping mask, when I heard that term originally, I thought, oh, they're talking about, you know, we talk about clipping our highlights, making them blown out, and clipping our shadows. And so that's where I got confused. But I want you to think about a clipping mask as a mask that is paper clipped to another layer. So if I were to clip this mask to this layer, it wouldn't affect this layer. You can see this way, if I shoot this layer off, this layer, this mask is also affecting this bottom layer because it's affecting everything underneath it, this adjustment. If I clip this to this layer only, then it will only affect that layer. And the way, I guess there's more than one way. There's more than one way to do almost everything in Photoshop. The way I do it is I hold the Option key and I go here and till I get this little symbol of the arrow with the mask. And what it's saying is paperclip this adjustment to the layer below it and not any of the other layers. So if I do that, whoops. What the heck is happening? Sorry, folks, that's a surprise. Oh, I know, I have to be on that layer and then do it. Now it paper clips this black and white layer to just that one. If I turn this layer off and leave this one on, I don't even know if it will stay on. I don't think it will. Then this one remains color. It's showing an eyeball there for that, but this mask, this layer, this adjustment layer does not affect anything except the layer directly below it. That's getting a little advanced, but I didn't want you to run into clipping masks and be as confused as I was. It probably took me 2 years before I finally understood what a clipping mask did. And if somebody just used the paperclip analogy, I would have understood it. Okay, let's talk about getting rid of distractions, because that's probably one of the very first things you'll do with Photoshop. And I just want to see, I think I'm using the same picture for that. So let's just use it there. I'm going to put Lightroom away. Here we are in Photoshop. I'm going to take away this. By the way, if you want to unpaperclip this, you just press Option again and you get that symbol and it undoes that. So let's get rid of this black and white thing and work on our background. Let's say we want to get rid of this bench over here and maybe this leaf and a few other things just to tidy up, because we often get stuff in our pictures that we didn't really want there. Well, you might think about going with the eraser, but that's not a good idea. It will erase the pixels and you'll be left with transparent where the object was. So what the tool I use most often is the spot healing brush, and it's a Band-Aid with kind of a little dotted circle beside it. And when you take it over here, you can see it looks like a circle with a plus in it. So if I want to get rid of this bench, well, the leaf is easy. And often I'll use a magnifying glass to get bigger so I can see what I'm doing better. Go back to my spot healing brush. I could start working here, but if I do, I'm working right on my pixel layer, and that's not a good idea because it's done there, it's baked in. So what I want to do is add a transparent layer above it and then work on that layer. You'll see what happens. So pardon me, I check this, I click on this little square with the plus. That gives me a new layer. I'm going to call it cleanup. And it's always a good idea to, I don't always do it, but it is a good idea to label your layers so you know what they are, because some people get like hundreds of layers. I've never gone that far, but someday, who knows? So this is my cleanup layer. I go up here and I make sure this is checked, sample all layers. If I don't have that checked, there's nothing for Photoshop to work with, nothing for that healing brush to work with. So I make sure that's on. And once you put it on once, it will stay on. So I go over here, and for something that's relatively simple like this leaf, all I have to do is paint over it and it's gone. Now you can do some of that with Lightroom, but Lightroom is not nearly as reliable for this sort of thing. I can just go and move all these things, and Photoshop does a really good job of getting rid of all the stuff that I don't want. And of course, it's better to do it in camera, but if you can't do it in camera, this is a pretty good option. There are other ways of doing this, but I don't want to throw all of them at you. This is the one that I use most of the time. This is kind of weird. We'll get rid of that. So when you've got a more complex thing like this bench, It helps to do it in sections. So I'm going to go up here and get rid of that leg. And that was enough that it could fill in the information from around it. I'm going to take this leaf out and then this leg. That's kind of cool, eh? It's just suspended in midair. Now you know how those levitation pictures are done. Now you know how those pictures of a sandwich coming together, each layer separately, is done. And then I'll take this out. That did a decent job, but not wonderful. It's going to go down that far. Like that. You want your painting to go a little bit beyond the bounds of what you're removing. And then let's see if we can remove the whole rest of it in one go. Not bad, not bad. And you can patch it up as you go, but that's one way to get rid of distractions. Another way, let me see what I've got in my notes here. Another way is the clone stamp tool. So let's toss this. Now, if I turn this layer off, everything that was there originally is there. Let's do the clone stamp tool. Again, I want to have a blank layer. So I'm going to be on this layer because I know that whatever layer I add is going to go above the active layer. So I want to make this layer active, hit the add layer, and then I'll show you a different way to do this. So this little thing that looks like an old-fashioned stamp that a librarian would use is your clone stamp tool. And what it does is it samples from one area of an image and places that the same pixels on another part of the picture. So if I want to get rid of this leaf, I can hold down the Option key and I get this special cursor, and I can click here and then let go of the Option key. And if I paint over this, it paints exactly what was over there. Now, you might be able to see that this is a duplicate of this, and that's one of the downsides of the clone stamp tool. For example, to make that clearer, if I were to sample from here, where there's this leaf, and then try to use that to get rid of that pine cone, it just copies the leaf over. That can be helpful in some situations, but most of the time that's not what you want. The clone stamp tool is trickier to use, and I only use it if the spot healing brush doesn't work. One of the tricks you can do with the clone stamp tool is to set your opacity at less than 100%, and then you could sample here and just sort of dab, and you could sample over here and dab, and sample over here and dab, and then it's not going to be a straight duplicate of anything else in your picture. The key thing to remember here is to do your cleanup on a fresh, transparent layer so that you're not destroying anything on the layer underneath. And as I showed you, I always magnify my work. You can do that with the magnifying glass, if I want to be exact. You can also do it by, I have a trackpad and I pinch my fingers together to go smaller. And I spread my fingers apart to go bigger. And the Command 0 key combination will get you to a size that fills the screen. So often I'll work at 200, 300, 400% to really work on details. And then I'll just hit Command or Control 0 and it gets me back to this view, my actual size view that fits. Any questions about that? We'll talk about selections in a minute.
Judy,
Yes.
when you're doing that last adjustment that you did there with removing the leaves and things on the grass,
Yep.
And you did that work on layer 1.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, could you do those on your copy of the background?
You could, but I wouldn't. Because the reason is because eventually I want to be able to throw away one of these two backgrounds so that I don't have I don't take so much space. It makes a bigger file because every one of these collections of pixels takes space on your hard drive, right? Makes your
Oh.
file bigger.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas on this layer, if we turn this off, this is all the pixels that are there on that layer. So that
Oh,
takes
yeah.
very little space on your hard drive. Whereas
Right.
if you do it on this, it's going to take more space.
Hmm.
And you would never want to throw away your original.
Right.
So that's why. And I often will use more than one layer for my cleanup. If I'm doing something really complex, I'll do one section on one layer and then get another layer and do that. And sometimes when I'm finished, I might merge these two layers together. And let's show you what that looks like if we do. So that is layer one. And this is the cleanup layer. Okay.
Yeah.
And if I merge them together, that's where that's with both of them on, but I can still turn them on and off independently. If I merge them by shift clicking to select both of them, and I go to layer, merge layers, now I can't adjust those individually. They are forever wedded together.
Hmm.
In this case, that's okay. And I will do this sometimes just to reduce the number of layers, because the more layers you have, the bigger your file size is going to be. Does that help?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, selections. Selections, you would make a selection if you wanted an effect that you're applying to only apply to one area. So I showed you the bucket before. There are lots of different selection tools. We'll start with the lasso because it's one of the first selection tools that ever was introduced in Photoshop. And a lasso is just a free form drawing thing. So I can draw any shape I want. And that selection is what my effect will be applied to. Now, if I add a black and white layer when I've already made a selection, then the black and white will only apply to the selection. That's kind of tricky and neat, right? And you can see the mask over here. It's applying the black and white layer to the part that's white, and it's masking off that effect from the rest of it, just like the masking tape on the window, keeping the paint from slopping over. There are not a lot of times when I would use the lasso tool because it's very imprecise. I use a graphics tablet for my post-production work, and it helps a lot. With a mouse, it would be even harder, but even with the graphics tablet, I rarely use the lasso for selecting. Once in a while, but not often. So I'm going to undo what I just did and undo that selection and show you a different way. So there are 3 different selection tools in this particular flyout menu. The magic wand tool I almost never use. I think it's Scott Kelby calls it the tragic wand tool because it really doesn't do a very good job, but let's try it and see. What it's supposed to do is select the object that you're dragging over. So if we want the red bucket, oh, you know why it selected that? Because I was on the wrong layer. I was on the cleanup layer. So let's deselect that, be on the correct layer, and do this and see if it, okay, it only got a bit of the bucket. So, okay, we can drag that around, but we can also turn on this, which means add to the selection. I want to, if I drag again, I want it to add to what I've already got. And you can see it's taking several times for this magic wand tool to try to select everything. It's missing a lot. So I almost never, actually I never use the magic wand tool. But if you're reading old tutorials, they probably will tell you to use it. This quick selection tool works much, much better. So if I unselect what we did last time, I'm on the right layer and I use this tool, and I can make my brush, my tool bigger and smaller by using the square bracket keys. So I make it a little smaller, and I'm just going to drag around the bucket. Look how fast that was. and how accurate compared to the other tool. Now you saw when I did this before that we still had some red. When we applied the black and white layer, we still had some red showing. So let's do that again. You can see little tinges of red, right? It's easier to see if I make it bigger for you. See little bits of red there?
Yeah.
So let's undo that. And I'm going to use the same tool again because it was pretty decent. Now we can go to the select menu and we can modify our selection. And we saw that it was just a little too small. So we can go to modify, expand. And we can say, I want you to select 2 more pixels than what we had last time. And click OK. And did you see it grew? Got a little bigger. And I'm thinking that 2 was too many. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to go to select, modify, expand 1 pixel. And see how that worked. And then you can also go to this select, modify, and you can feather the edges. And this will often make things, instead of having an abrupt cutoff between 2 things, you'll have more of a feathered gradual transition from one to the other. So we're going to feather that by, let's say 2 pixels and click OK. And then we're going to go to the black and white adjustment. Well, we still got a little bit. We could have expanded it further, but you do have those controls to go back in and say, okay, that didn't work so well. Let's try 2 pixels expansion or 3 pixels expansion. And it takes some trial and error. Of course, the more you use Photoshop, the better you get at knowing what you need. I find if I'm cutting something out from the background, using a feathered edge will make it not look like I've cut and pasted something. Like if you took a magazine picture and you cut it out with scissors and you put it on a piece of construction paper and you pasted it on there, you would see a very, very clear outline. It would be very clear that those things were not together in the first place. But if you feather the edge, then it can look like they blend into each other better. Another thing you can do, let's undo that and undo that selection. You can go to select, well, select subject works pretty well, but not on this particular picture. I'll show you that in a minute on a different picture. Okay, so going backwards is my next heading on my outline. And there are several layers of undo in Photoshop, and you can set in your Photoshop preferences. There's a place to tell it how many undos you want to have in place. I'm not going to get into all these preferences right now. The defaults are not bad. So I would start with those. And if you find that something's not working for you, then investigate the others. And there's lots of tutorials online about preferences in Photoshop. But I can set, I think mine is set for 50 levels of undo. So I can, if I want to go way backwards, I can do that. You can also do that through something called the history panel. But my point is that in some programs, you can only do 1 or 2 levels of undo. And in Photoshop, you can do a lot. If you have a less powerful computer, you're probably better to set that number lower. And if you have a more powerful computer, then you could probably go with 50 or 100 undos if you want to. I'm going to talk about some adjustment layers. So let's get this back so the whole thing is on here. And I showed you before that these things here are your adjustment layers. And if we drift our cursor over each one, it'll tell us what it is. So this tells us this is brightness and contrast. This is levels. This is curves. This is exposure. This is vibrance, hue and saturation, color balance, black and white, photo filters, channel mixers, color lookup tables, invert, posterize, threshold, selective color, and gradient map. Now I basically use mostly the top row and the black and white, and that's all I use. That might change as I learn more, but if you try to take on too much of Photoshop at once, you just choke on it. I once gave a talk called How Do You Eat an Elephant? And the answer, of course, is one bite at a time. And that's also how you learn Photoshop. So let's look at the brightness and contrast adjustment is something that I almost never use. I'm going to make my active layer the top one because I want the adjustment to apply to everything. And I'm going to go to brightness and contrast. As I say, I almost never use this, but it works this way. You turn the brightness up, it affects the whole picture. And of course, we can go in and mask it off. If we want everything to be dark, but we want that bucket to be bright, we could go in and paint with black on the mask to mask off the effect off the bucket so it would stay at its original brightness. We can also do this with contrast. We can take the contrast way up, we can take it way down. As I say, I never use this adjustment. So I'm going to throw that one away.
Well, Judy, on
Yes.
those adjustments there, like for brightness and contrast, most of the time you would have already looked after that in ACR, right?
Exactly, exactly. Those are things that I want to do in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. Yeah.
Mm.
I'm going to go to levels next. We'll do a levels adjustment. Now, levels gives you a little more control. You can see there's a histogram here. And if I move, this is the black point and this is the white point. If I move my black point over, watch what happens. Things should get darker. I'm not seeing any difference. That's strange. Okay, it's just slow. Things are getting lighter, sorry. And if I move this one, things get darker, but I can move these points. This one will make it darker. I'm moving more and more and more blacks. This one will make it lighter. I'm getting more and more brights. And I'm going to blow out highlights this way, right? And this one is your midtones. So you can adjust your midtones to be brighter or darker. And again, I almost never use this adjustment. And the reason is because there's a more accurate adjustment to use. Curves can be confusing to start with, and you might have to watch this more than once, but I'm going to get rid of this levels and show you a curves adjustment. So I'm on the top layer, I click the curves adjustment, and I get this wonky looking thing. Okay, so what you're seeing here is this is the histogram for brightness in this picture. We've got a lot of dark tones and not so many bright tones. Think of this like a graph. If you look across the bottom here, it goes from black through gray to white. Think of this like a bar graph where the gray hump there is showing you how much of each tone is in the picture. So if you go to this tone here, we've got just a little bit of that white. If we go to this gray and go straight up, we've got that much. When we go to this gray, we've got that much. When we go to black, we've just got a little bit. It's like a graph showing you each of these 256 shades of gray and how much of each of those shades is in your picture. Now, if I want to change my, I could change contrast. Watch what's happening as I move my cursor from here over onto the picture. Can you see that circle moving up and down that diagonal line on the histogram? What it's doing is this little eyedropper is putting a dot on that line wherever the tone is. So let's say we're going to go for this tone here, green. It's a midtone, right? You can see the circles in the middle. And the cool thing is that if you have this little thing turned on, which I do, and I think it might be turned on by default, then if I just click on this tone and drag, I can drag up to make that tone brighter. I can drag down to make that tone darker, but you can see that the line is smooth. So the transition from one tone to another is going to be smooth. And of course, I can go in and mask this off certain areas. If I've got one area that I want that brightness, then I can go in and say, take it off the water just by painting with black on my mask to mask it away like the masking tape. A typical curve for contrast is to go up a little bit at that level and down a little bit at this and just make a gentle S curve. You can see that's a lot more contrasty. If I turn it off, that's what we started with. And this is what we have now. Not something I would do to this picture, but that's how curves work. You're making an adjustment to the contrast. And I would say never put more than 2, maximum 3 points on this line. If I get a point and I want to get rid of it, I just grab it and drag it off. And I can grab that one and drag it off. And then I'm back to my original. So the key thing to think about with curves is that this is a bar graph showing you how much of each one of these tones along the bottom is in the picture. It'll take some playing with that, but curves is a very, very useful thing. I think this water may be blown out, but if I click on it and go down, yeah, it is blown out. If you had highlights that were too bright but weren't quite blown out, then that would help them come down again. Okay, so we're at just past an hour, and I'm going to talk now about black and white. This is one of the places where Photoshop can excel. So there are many ways to convert a photograph to black and white. And I often do that in Lightroom. If I don't need to go to Photoshop, I don't, because when I go to Photoshop, I end up with 2 files, which takes twice as much space on my hard drive. So if I can do what I want to do in Lightroom, then that's where I do it. And most of the time I do black and white there. You don't want to just desaturate your picture. So let me show you what that would be like. If we change this picture to black and white by desaturating, we would go to a hue saturation layer and we would drag the saturation down to nothing. Yes, it's black and white, but you have absolutely no control over what tone gets associated with a color. It just all goes that way. And I have a better picture to show you this on. So I'm going to close this, not going to save it, go back into Lightroom. And I have this picture. So at the top, you've got the original color picture. And at the bottom, you have what happens if you just desaturate the color. And you can see that everything is pretty close to the same shade of gray. So if you had an actual photograph of a landscape and you did that, it would just look like mud. Everything would be the same tone and it would just be blah. You have no control. But watch what happens if we take this, actually we'll do it right on here. If we, in Lightroom, change it to black and white. So I'm going to go to the develop module. I'm going to tell it that I want black and white. Now that looks pretty terrible, right? But I can go down here to the black and white sliders and I can play with these sliders to make different tones. So I can make the red darker, and you can see that there's some red in some of these other colors, or I can make the red brighter. Gives me a lot more control. I can do the same with orange. I can make orange bright or make orange dark. And most colors that you see are a combination of these colors. Make the yellow really bright, make the yellow really dark. Look at that. That's a yellow block and it's turned black because I took it down. So you have tremendous control when you do your conversions this way. Green, same thing, and all the way down. So this is the way that I do 99% of my black and white work. I change it to black and white in Lightroom, and then I go and play with the sliders until I get what I want. Now, the advantage of Photoshop for this, it works very similarly, and we'll go there in a minute. The advantage of Photoshop is if say I have a guy in a red jacket in the foreground on my picture, and he's my subject. Red jacket is great because it's going to draw my eye. But let's say there's a red car off in the background, and that red is also going to draw my eye, and I don't want it. And maybe I want the tone of the red jacket to be different than the tone of the car. Well, in Lightroom, I can't do that because anything I do in Lightroom applies to everything in the picture unless I mask it off. And if I mask it off here, I'm gonna lose the black and white. So it's the advantage of Photoshop is because you have more than one layer, you can make the red on the jacket dark and the red on the car light and combine them together. I don't do that very often, but it is a possibility in Photoshop. So let's go back, reset this the way it was. So we have our colors, and we're going to take this into Photoshop this time. Photo, edit in, Photoshop. And I'm going to edit a copy again. Once you set these things, they stay set that way. And so it's kind of nice. You don't have to worry about it after the first time. So I'm just going to put my Lightroom away. We're in Photoshop. Now, there are a number of ways to do this. One way is to click the gradient map adjustment. And if I do that, you can see that I got a better result than I got by desaturating, but I still don't have a whole lot of control. So there are people like Sharon Tenenbaum, if you watch her programs on Tuesday morning, she likes this gradient map thing, but she doesn't shoot a lot of colorful things. She shoots a lot of architecture and bridges and things. So I don't tend to use that for my black and white conversions. Instead, I'll go to the black and white adjustment tool, click that. Now I have sliders. And I can, again, just like in Lightroom, I can make my reds darker, I can make my yellows brighter, I can make my greens brighter, pound down my blues, work with my magentas. So you have a lot of control here to get what you want. When you desaturate something, you just throw all that information away. Here, I can go back in afterwards. Let's say we close this off, and maybe we add a blank layer and we draw something on it, paint something on it. If I click my foreground color, I can get a color palette and get a nice, and do this. Now, it's not painting pink. That's because it's underneath the black and white layer. If I move the black and white layer down, then the pink shows, because remember that this layer affects what is below it, but not what is above it. Let's see what else. I don't think I'm going to get into this next point that I was going to get into. It's a little too complicated. Okay, cropping. Any questions on the black and white stuff? This is how you get powerful black and whites. One of the secrets of getting powerful black and whites. Okay. Back into Lightroom. And a different picture. Oh, I want to show you this because skin is something to pay attention to. Let's go back into, let's take this one into Photoshop, edit in Photoshop. Now, if we make this black and white, I want you to notice, turn that off and on. Look where the red and the orange are on the picture, and then look at what they do and what his skin does. Okay, Caucasian people's skin is mostly orange and red. So if we get this little, what they call a targeted adjustment tool, this little hand, I can go onto his skin and I can drag up or down to make his skin darker or lighter. Oops. Oh, I'm on the mask. You see what happened? I clicked on the mask with black and it took the effect off. Good lesson. I want to be on the black and white adjustment layer. Get the targeted adjustment brush, targeted adjustment tool. Now it's an eyedropper. Now I know it's going to work. So I can make his, by clicking and dragging down or up, I can make his skin darker. Come on. It's not going very far. Or lighter. You can see it on the rainbow behind him. But you can see a little bit in his face too. And so, but again, you can adjust your oranges and reds in Lightroom and make a preset for skin. So I have two Lightroom presets that I've made that are starting points for adjusting Caucasian skin. And if I had the good fortune to photograph other skin colors, then I would have to do the same for those as well. Oh, let's see where we're at. Okay. Close that one. Back to Lightroom. Okay, cropping. Almost all the time, I crop in Lightroom and I do it right towards the end of my process. Because again, it's non-destructive. So if I say I want to do a, say a 2x3 of this and I move it over like that, and then I say, oh, I want to, okay, do that, say I'm done. And then I say, oh no, I changed my mind. No problem. It's non-destructive. I can go back in and I can put it the way that I had it before, unlock the lock and make it the way it was before. So almost always I crop in Lightroom, but there's one exception. So let's go into Photoshop again, photo, edit in Photoshop. If I'm having my photograph, my subject centered, I try to have, you know, the same amount of space on both sides. And this is kind of wonky. There's much more space here between the edge of the petal and the edge of the frame than there is over here. So actually what I want to do is I want to add more frame to this. Now this is going to be easy because it's a plain background, but it actually works on skies and some landscapes. It's worth a try. So what I do here is I'm going to go to the crop tool, which is this one, same look as in most programs. And you'll see I've got these handles. Now there's two things to be aware of up here in this bar. One is delete crop pixels. If I have that on and I crop in and say, okay, then those pixels are gone forever. So I keep that off unless I'm absolutely sure that I want to get rid of those pixels. I leave that one off. But this one, in this case, I want on because what I'm going to do, and it's not intuitive, is I'm going to crop to make my picture bigger, not smaller. So I'm going to drag it out to about there and let go. And I've got content aware checked, and it's going to fill in that space for me. So I'm going to click the check mark to say, yes, that's what I want, and watch and wait. And it's taking its time. There we go. And if we enlarge this, just to check and make sure that it didn't do any kind of wonky transition between my original and the stuff it added, we can see that that is pretty darn wonderful extension. Now, that's magic. I love that.
Well, does that only work on sort of plain featureless parts like that?
Can you show me at least one more time and on maybe a busier background to see what it looks like?
Sure, I'm going to show you once more here and then we'll go to a different picture.
Okay, writing it down.
Let's see, get back into Photoshop. Where'd it go? There it is. And take this down to its regular size. Oh, it wants me to. What does it want me to do? Okay, I'm on the move tool, that's why. So now I'm going to the crop tool. Oh, I guess I need to undo so I can show you again. There it is. I got the crop tool. I'm just going to drag this way. Now, if I go too far, it's going to have trouble. Let's see what happens if I do that. And so sometimes I'll do a little bit and a little bit and a little bit instead of doing all three at once. If I break it down and do smaller sections, it'll work better. Oh, it actually did a pretty darn good job there. I'm surprised. What I was expecting it to do was to take some of this and duplicate it over here too. But let's try this on a more complex kind of picture. So let's try, well, let's see what it does to this one. So we'll go into Photoshop, edit a copy, and we'll get the crop tool. We already have it, and we're going to drag this out this way and see what it does. And what it should do is carry those curves on. So I'm going to click the check mark to say, yes, that's what I want. Let it work. Not bad. That's actually pretty impressive. Now, if I make it bigger to check it, I may have to go in and do a little bit of cloning. See, that's not clean. That's not clean. This is not bad up here, but this spot here needs to be fixed. And there's a spot here that's not so great, but I could, add a blank layer, get my spot healing tool, make sure I'm on the right, the new blank layer. And let's see what happens if we do this. Yeah, it's still not great. So the more complex your background, the more difficulty we'll have, but you'd be surprised that sometimes it does a pretty credible job. And one of the places I've seen it done quite well is skies. Okay, where we were here. Let's see. Black and white, cropping. Oh, aspect ratios. In Lightroom, you can go to crop and you can set aspect ratios, right? You can set it to be square or 8.5 by 11 or 8 by 10, 5 by 7, and so forth. We tell it we want it 5 by 7, it might do that. And if we wanted it the other way around, we press X and it turns it the other way around. So we can do that. But I don't actually want to do that. You can do the same thing in Photoshop. You can set up in the upper left, there's a place to set your aspect ratio so that if you want a perfect square, you can get a perfect square. Okay, what time are we at? We're at 8:24. We're doing pretty well here. Filters. Yeah, here's the picture I was going to use for that. Let's go back into Photoshop with this one. Photo, edit in, Photoshop. And we'll enter, actually, I'm going to do the original because I'm going to tell it not to save it anyway. So here we have our picture. And there's a lot of filters. We're not going to talk about all of them, but we can, and I'm going to copy this layer so that I've got a duplicate so it doesn't wreck my original. One of the ones that's kind of fun to play with is to go to liquify. This is a tool that people in the fashion industry use a lot. That's why everybody looks better than you do, because they're photoshopped within an inch of their lives and their waists are reduced and their bust line is increased. And this is the tool that does that. But we can play with it. If I want this stem to be curved, can you see that there's sort of a grid here? And if I put the center of this circle next to the stem, click and drag it down, look what it's doing. It's dragging the stem. And then I can put it on the other side of the stem at the bottom and drag it like that. And then I can say, okay, and look at that, I got a curvy stem. Now, if you go too far with that, the pixels, what's happening is Photoshop is actually stretching the pixels. And there's a limit to how far you can get away with stretching pixels and make it look good. Now I can undo that, but I can't go back in and say, well, I just wanted a little bit more, a little bit less, unless I'm going to undo that. If I am on my layer and I go up here to filter and say convert for smart filters, this is going to make a bigger file, but it makes it more re-editable. So, okay, it's taking a minute. It's turning this into a smart object. And it's added this little badge at the bottom of the icon for the picture. Now, if I go into filter, liquify, and I push this stem just a little bit that way and just a little bit this way, and then say, okay. And now I say, oh, I forgot I wanted to liquefy this too, and a little bit more down here. Now, because it's a smart filter, I actually can go back in and fix it. And I got to remember how. This is where we're running into the weak points in my knowledge. Okay, so I'm going to push this further and push this further. I'm going to take this little curl and push it up a little bit. Actually, that doesn't look good, so I'm going to undo that. Well, actually, let's see what it does. And then I'm going to click OK. And now it's let me do that because it was a smart filter. And you can see that both the liquify adjustments are there. So the takeaway from this is filters are cool, fun to play with, but you can't go back and re-edit them unless you make them smart filters first. What else are we going to tell you about filters? Another filter that you might use, and we'll just leave this as it is, it's kind of funky, is a Gaussian blur, and that will blur part of your picture. So if we go to filter, and I'm not going to bother doing the smart filter thing because I've already explained that. Go to blur, Gaussian blur. Oh, that's interesting. Doesn't want to do it because it's already a smart layer. Let's do it on this layer. We'll go here, filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Can you see it went fuzzy? And we can adjust this slider to make it fuzzier or less fuzzy. And so for some of my flower pictures, I will actually go in, I shoot them super sharp. I often use focus stacking and every bit of the flower is pin sharp, but I might actually go in and blur it a little bit to give it a softer look. So if I say okay, now I didn't do another background layer, so you can't actually see it, but it just softens. Maybe you can see it if I go bigger. The edges, can you see that? That's not crisp anymore. It's just slightly softened. Now, where this can be really beneficial, I'm going to back up here with my undo. Where this can be beneficial is, let's say that I shot this on a background that wasn't completely smooth. And it came out with bumps and stuff in it, because this is actually, my background is a piece of foam core board. And it's smooth because I focus stacked this, but left the foam core out of the focus stack. So that worked. But what I could do, and I was going to show you this other selection tool anyway, is I can select the subject. And in this case, it did a pretty good job, right? It missed some. So I can click on this quick select tool and I can add in the parts it missed by just painting over them with this tool. Oops, I got too much. If I hold Option down and paint over the part that's not supposed to be included, it'll take it away. And sometimes it takes a little tweaking to get this the way you want it. And we missed a little bit up here. We want to subtract that little thing there, but it's a pretty decent job, right? Add a little bit in here when it missed. Pretty good. And I can expand it. Remember, we can, when we select, we can modify it. So we could expand it by a couple of pixels just to make sure that we're getting enough. Then I could invert the selection to select only the background, select inverse, and then I could blur the background, and that can be useful if your background isn't smooth. Let's see. Oh, another thing I wanted to show you. Let's quit this picture. Go to a different one. It's kind of fun. I think you'll have fun with this one. Back to Lightroom. Let's take this one into Photoshop. Edit in Photoshop. One of the kind of fun filters to use is a radial blur. So you can do various kinds of blur. You can do a motion blur. You know, if you wanted to make a car look like it was going really fast, you could, you know, apply this kind of blur to it. This can look like intentional camera movement. You could have a picture of a forest and you could change the angle here to 90 degrees. And you could, this looks like an intentional camera movement shot. So that you can fake that intentional camera movement shot. But another one that's kind of fun to play with is blur, radial blur. And when you use this one, it's like that kind of zoom effect. And there's several different settings here, but let's try this one so you can see. We've got a spin effect with an amount of 10. And if we click OK, you can see it looks like the flower is spinning, and there's more blur on the outside than in the inside. The inside stays fairly sharp. If we undo that, go back to the blur, radial blur, change it to zoom. Now it's done this. See, it's like it's blurring out from the center towards the edges. And we undo that. Go back into a filter again, blur, radial blur. Let's say we liked that, but we wanted more of it. If we'd done it as a smart object, we could have had more without going in, but let's do it this way. Now you've got more. Okay. Now I don't know that there's a way to move the center of it around. It makes sense to me there should be, but we might be reaching the limits of my knowledge here. Yeah, I don't see a way to move that center around. But I'm not going to tell you can't, because there's way more that I don't know about Photoshop than there is that I do know about Photoshop. And I think that's true for most people. Let's see, cropping, filters, liquify. Okay, fancy stuff to whet your appetite. This, I think we're timing's pretty good here. This is not stuff I'm going to teach you, but it's stuff that is fun to play with, and I want to show you the potential so that you may get excited enough to learn some of this stuff. Some of it you may never want to learn, and that's fine. But let's see what I've got for you. So let's take this photograph again and take it into Photoshop. And I am going to start with that crop because this composition just doesn't work for me. So I'm going to drag it out to about there. Content aware is on. Click the check mark. And we'll get that. Now, Photoshop has a way of selecting by color range. So we're going to select the sampled colors. And let's say I want the greens. So I'm going to click here on a green. And it got some of the green. Actually did a pretty good job. If I wanted to add more, I could click this little eyedropper with the plus sign, and we could add in a little bit more. And you can see what's being selected is the white. Now anything that becomes my mask. So I can say, okay. And that is selected. You can see the marching ants. Now, if I apply a black and white layer, for example, it's only applied the black and white to the green. And actually, if I'd done a little bit less, that could be kind of interesting. So I could change the saturation or something, but that gives you an idea. Or the other thing I can do is when you've got a layer, any kind of layer, an adjustment layer or whatever, you can change the opacity. So if I like the black and white on the green, but it's a little too much, I can back it up. And now I've got like 38% of the black and white on the green, or take it up a little bit to get a desaturated green. Maybe I have something red in the picture that I don't want desaturated. I just want the greens desaturated, so I can select by color. So that's kind of a cool thing. The other thing that I do use more and more, and I'm still learning on this, folks, so I've got a long way to go, but I'm quite excited about it, is this is a plugin called Lumenzia. And I forget what it costs, but it's not hellishly expensive, or I wouldn't have bought it. And it's very complex, and I've scratched the surface with this. But what I like is you can make masks based on the luminance values or the brightness and darkness shades of your picture. And that really helps if you want to do some dodging and burning. So let's just show you how that works. This D is for darks, M is for midtones, and L is for lights. And you can go and select just the darks or smaller ranges of darks, just the lights, just the midtones, whatever. So in this picture, when I look at this photograph, and when I shoot these, I'm always thinking black and white. I want to do black and white with these, but I've started in color. I look at it and I think there is too much contrast right here. That contrast draws the eye, and that's going to pull the viewer's attention to that area. And that's not what I want the viewer to look at. So again, I'm going to copy my layer so I have sort of an insurance policy there. And I'm going to go here and I'm going to say, okay, choose, let's see, would that be darks? Let's see, if I click on the D for darks to select just the darks, oh, it's selected too much. Remember that anything white is selected and is going to be affected by what I do, and anything dark is not, but that's too much. Let's go to darks too. What I'm trying to do is isolate this really darkish contrasty spot here, and that's not doing it. So go down to D3. Oh, we're getting closer. Try D4. That's pretty close. And I can adjust how much is selected. I can fine tune it here, but I want to go a little bit this way. That's about what I want. Anything that's black is not going to get the effect. Anything that white is going to get all of the effect, and anything that's gray is going to get some of the effect. So then I say, okay, what I want to do is I want to change my levels on this one. I told you I don't use levels very often, but sometimes I do. So now I've got a mask. If I click the mask, you can see that it made the mask for me. I didn't have to go in and select. I didn't have to go in and paint. It did it for me based on the luminance values or the brightness values in the picture. So now if I go to my levels adjustment and I say, I want to play with that and see, oh, I don't want it darker. That's not what I want. Let's make those midtones lighter. Look what's happening to it. Very fine adjustment. That's about what I want. That's 1.49. If I go back to what it was, which was 1, that's what we started with. And we ended up about there. Now I've got rid of that area of high contrast. Now I'm going to add a black and white adjustment just so you can see what a difference that makes on a monochrome picture. So if we take that levels adjustment off, that's without it, and there's with it. It's subtle, but I can also go back in and I can change it. I could play with whites, I could play with darks, I could probably shift midtones is what I want to do here. So I can make them darker or lighter and get them wherever I want them. That's pretty powerful. Then I could look at this and say, oh, wouldn't it be nice to dodge and burn the shadows and highlights a little bit and make that form stand out better? So I could say, okay, let's do another adjustment based on luminance. And I happen to know, because I worked on this earlier today, that the lights 4 is what I want for this one. So the effect is not going to be applied to anything that's black. It will be applied to anything that's white, and it will be partially applied to anything that's gray. So now I'm going to say, yep, that's the mask I want. Now I'm going to tell it I want a levels adjustment again, let's say. Now I can go to that levels adjustment and I can bring the whites in and brighten those areas. And it is subtle because we've got such finely tuned mask. Let's say I didn't want it to apply to some of the picture. I could go to this. I could select the subject like we did before, and I'm not going to fine tune it this time, but you get the idea. And then I could say, well, I actually don't want it to apply to the background, so I'm going to invert my selection and have the background selected instead of the subject. Select inverse. And then I'm going to fill that. I'm going to go to the mask, which is here. And we know right now this mask is like that. But I tell it I want to fill all this background with black on the mask. So I go to edit, fill with black. And now I've got the nice subtle stuff on the flower where I wanted it, but I've kept the effect off the background. So here's without that, and here's with it. It just makes it appear a little better. And then I would probably go on and I would select these midtones and I'd darken them, and I could do my dodging and burning that way. There's so much potential. Then you could never do this in Lightroom to the same extent at all. Let's do something different with this picture. Let's take that level away and this one away. Get rid of that adjustment, get rid of that adjustment. Okay, now we have 2 copies of this picture. Let's say I wanted to do something kind of funky. Let's say I want to take this one and turn it upside down. So I click on that layer and I go to edit, transform, rotate 180 degrees. Now I can either change the opacity of that layer to 50%, and now I see both calla lilies, which is kind of fun. Or I can go into something called blending modes, and I can go to darken, and it will show me the dark parts. Probably blending modes get really complicated, so probably the best way to start is, and what Sharon Tenenbaum teaches, is go to 50% with the first one. And then if you do another one, go to 25% with that one. And you can do all kinds of funky things. And of course, you can mask off too. So if we wanted to, we could make a mask here by clicking this little thing that looks like the Japanese flag. That's your mask tool. It adds a mask to that layer. And then we could get a black brush. And I'm gonna have to make this bigger so I can see what I'm doing. We're on the upside down flower. And let's say we want to make it look like the upside down flower is behind this flower. And we can get our brush about the right size and start brushing out. Now, this is not going to be precise. And I do try to be very, very precise with my editing, but for the purposes of teaching. Now you can see there's a problem here in that the opacity is not lining up right. Let's go back to 100% and see what it does if we go to darken. Still doesn't work well. What if we do, oh, that's what we can do. We can do 100%. We can change this mask back, go to a white brush. And just get rid of that. Oh, what was I gonna do? It's getting late, folks. My brain's getting tired. Oh, yeah, let's shut this one off. Let's go to this one. We're gonna select the subject. Make sure we're on the layer that we want to be working on. Select the subject. I'm not going to do the fine tuning this time in the interest of time. I'm going to invert the selection. So I've got the background selected. And I'm going to, oh, actually, I don't want to do that on that layer. Hang on. Sorry, folks. Do it on this layer. Make this layer invisible for a moment. Select subject. Invert the selection. And then we've got the background selected. Now we want to move from being on the picture to being on the mask, and then fill this background of the mask with black. Now that's made that background disappear. But when we turn the other layer on, the other flower is there. So now both layers are at 100% and they layer in like that. This is just to whet your appetite, just to show you the kinds of things that you can play with. And mirroring is the other thing I was going to show you. There's a few of you have expressed an interest in that before. So I'm going to get rid of this layer. And this is going to be a challenge because I didn't practice this, but let's say we really like this picture and we want to make a mirror of it. And maybe that's not the best picture to use as an example, but let's see what else I've got. Actually, the sand dune might make a cool mirror. Let's try that. So we'll go back into Photoshop. Edit in Photoshop. Copy. Close that other one. Oops. Yeah, that's right. Don't save. Okay. So we look at this and we think, oh, maybe that would make a nice mirror. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to crop it because I think the mirroring might happen really well along this axis. And we keep this part, get rid of this part. So I hit my crop tool and I pull it in this time to about there. I think that might be a nice place to mirror it. So I'm not going to delete my crop pixels. This way, if I change my mind and I want to crop it differently, I can come back and do it because the pixels aren't actually being thrown away. If this was clicked, delete, then yes, they would be thrown away and I couldn't get them back. So I'm going to say, yep, that's the crop I want. Yeah, okay. Now I'm going to, if I want to mirror this, I have to have twice as much canvas. The canvas is what your picture sits on. So I go to image size. I set it for %. And I say, I want 200%. And I never get this right the first time, folks. And I don't want that. I just want the width to be, I want it to be 200. I want it to be twice as wide as it is now. Same resolution. This makes it bigger file size. See, it was 17 megabytes. It's now going to be 35 megabytes almost. But I'm going to say, okay. And it just, oh, I'm showing you how not to do it, folks. Sorry. Okay. You can see, I warned you, I'm not an expert at this. Canvas size. This is what I want. So we're going to go to %. We're going to tell it, actually, we're going to try to tell it 100% bigger. See if that will work. No, I'm going to call it 200%. And then this little box tells me, well, where do you want the extra canvas added? Do you want to anchor this picture in the middle or the top, the bottom, the sides? What do you want to do? Well, what we want is we want extra canvas on the left-hand side because that's where we want the mirror to come. So I tell it to anchor it to the right-hand side and it will stretch the canvas out to the left. So now we should get the result we want. There we are. Now we have the canvas we want. And I'm going to make this a little smaller. Oh, you know what? It didn't accept the crop. I'm messing up here. Back. There's the crop. Maybe I do need to throw away the pixels. Back to the crop tool. Yes, let's just delete the pixels and hit return. There we go. Now those pixels are gone. Now we should be able to do it. Back into image, canvas size, %, 200%. I have the instructions for this written down. If you want them, I can give them to you. Anchor it on that side. Click OK. Okay, it's too big, but that's all right. We can deal with that. Now what I'm going to do is I want to select this image and I want to duplicate. I want to duplicate this layer. I'm going to deselect that. No, that's right. I want to duplicate the whole thing. I should have practiced this today, guys, and I didn't. I practiced other things for you. Okay, so we're going to duplicate that, and then we're going to flip this one. Anything that's a checkerboard like this is transparent. So we're on this layer, and we're going to flip it. So we go to Edit, Transform, and I think it's Flip Horizontal. Okay, yes. Now the picture has gone that way. Now I can drag a guide from this ruler. If I click on this ruler and drag, I get this thing they call a guide. And I've got mine so it will snap to the edge of that. And that's going to be useful in a minute. So I'm going to take this flipped one. I'm on the top layer. I'm going to grab this thing, which is a move tool. I'm going to hold down Shift because I want it to move perfectly horizontally. I don't want it going up or down at all. So I'm going to hold Shift to constrain its movement. And I'm going to drag this over to the guideline and it'll snap to that guide. And there's my picture. And then I can make the guide go away. And then of course I can grab the crop tool and I can bring this in, crop it, and there's my mirror. And this is fun. It doesn't work well with every image. I don't find this one particularly engaging, but it can be quite interesting. You may have seen my image. I'll just show it to you. I have a directory of, yeah, I have a directory somewhere in here of mirrored images. Mirrored. So I think I'm looking for my favorite one, and it might not be in here. Oh, here it is. So what I did here was I mirrored the arbutus shot, and then I went to my whale pictures and found one that would blend well in, and I added that in on top of the mirrored picture. And so I've seen mirrors done before, but I had never seen mirrors with an unmirrored part. And that was kind of fun to create. I did something similar with, oh, maybe that one isn't in here either. No, you can do mirrors up and down instead of side to side. So this one is an example where I had the picture, I cropped it along this line, and then I flipped it vertically instead of horizontally and made my mirror that way. So, I mean, you can just be so creative with Photoshop. So let me look at my outline here. Oh, resources. I promised to show you resources. So go back to this presentation. And you might want to take a screenshot of this. Okay. Come on. Come on, Photoshop. Might be user error, folks. Wouldn't that be awful? But I know I put the resources in. Let me find it somewhere else. For my Photoshop class. Resources, there you are. And if you want to take a screenshot of that, feel free. I think the best Photoshop teacher anywhere, and Lightroom teacher for that matter, is Ben Wilmar. He is so knowledgeable, but he's also really, really good at explaining things. And I have bought his Photoshop bootcamp and his Lightroom bootcamp from creativelive.com. And when you buy them, you can download them and watch them as many times as you want. They can live on your computer. You can watch them out in the middle of the forest. You don't need Wi-Fi to get them. So I highly recommend his classes, and Creative Live has sales on quite often. His complete bootcamp for Lightroom and his complete bootcamp for Photoshop are phenomenal. And they come with reference guides too, little sort of workbook things. Sharon Tenenbaum is a Vancouver photographer she's an internationally recognized photographer in the area of architecture and bridges. She does absolutely glorious black and white stuff. And she has a free session Tuesday mornings at 10 o'clock called Talk and Learn. If you go to SharonTenenbaum.com, you can sign up for those. And there are a bunch of us from the club that go to those every Tuesday. And then the other instructor that I found just recently is Nathaniel Dodson, and his YouTube channel is called TootVid. And he has little short ones that you can go and view just how to do one little thing in Photoshop. So these are the best resources I can offer you. The other additional one for Lightroom would be lightroomqueen.com. That's very good. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen unless somebody tells me that, wait a minute, I haven't got the screenshot yet. And look at that, you stayed with me. That was a long session, and I apologize for some of the fumbling, but I did warn you that I'm still learning. I hope that you got some understanding about layers and masks and all that sort of thing. Any questions?
Yeah, I had one.
Yep.
When you were doing the lasso tool, you said you could expand it by 1 or 2 pixels. What heading did you find that expand?
It was under Select,
Under select?
Modify.
Thank you.
And that's also where you feather it.
It was a terrific session, Judy. Really, I learned a lot.
Oh, awesome. I
Yeah.
wasn't sure you would,
Oh,
Ricardo.
no, I learned a lot.
Thought, why is she coming?
Yeah, no. There's so much I don't know. As you say, it's something that, there's sort of, you could learn it endlessly. I mean, aspects of it. So no, and I did take a Photoshop course. It's from Australia, but I found your presentation far superior.
Oh, thank you.
And he did not talk about the destructiveness of Photoshop at all. I really didn't know that. You were very clear. He would sort of blather on sometimes, and I'm thinking, why is he doing this? And he would be far too repetitive, and you got to the germ of the idea.
Well, I'm a teacher.
Concept. Yeah, no, I
I'm not a
know. But it
photograph-
shows.
I'm not a Photoshop expert,
Yeah.
but I am a teacher. So if you
But-
remember overhead projectors, paper clips for clipping masks to another layer, and masking tape to keep the paint off the window. Those
That
three
makes sense.
analogies, I think, will help you out.
Judy?
Yeah.
You were struggling with an analogy for the filters in your overhead projector model. And that could be just you're putting a red filter over top of it. You're literally putting a red piece over top, and there's your filter. So
Good
now
point.
you've got a red image.
Yeah.
Now you don't have the sophistication in that, of course.
Right.
You can't select pieces of it, but it's just there's your filter over
You
top.
could have a magic piece of acetate that goes on and makes it black and white, or a magic piece that makes it, more contrasty or something.
Have you ever seen with those acetate filters, the ones with the hinged layers that you put on? You can put on and on. So I think there's multiple layers you can stick on it.
When I was a teacher in the
Body.
classroom, I never got quite that sophisticated, but I was very impressed with those who did.
Judy, I've got a very basic question.
Sure.
When you're doing some basic editing, and then you can either save what you've done or you can save as.
Right.
When you save as, I'm assuming that you're not affecting the original in that way.
That's a good assumption, but it kind of depends on which version of Photoshop you're using, because they've just recently changed that. And it depends on whether you came to it from Lightroom or you came to it from Bridge or just dragging something into Photoshop. And that's one of the reasons I always go to Photoshop from Lightroom. Partly because it keeps my catalog nice and organized, but also if I take a raw file into Photoshop and then work with it and then save it back, it doesn't cover up, it doesn't replace my raw file. But you're quite right, Linda, that you could do a save as and get it a different, like if you did one with a spin filter, you could save as with the spin, and then you could go back to the original and do something else wild with a different version of it. And you could have 8 different versions of the same thing.
Because that's what I've been doing. I do a save as, and then I just add to the save as, if I want to add anything else.
But every time you do that, of course, you're making another copy of the file, and Photoshop files tend to be kind of big. So I will periodically go through and throw out the ones that I don't want.
Right, exactly. That's what I do too. I clean up the others, get rid of them.
And with Photoshop, you can also use like Nik plugins as a plug-in to Photoshop. You can use Topaz and a lot of different things as plugins. I think even On One can be used as a plugin into Photoshop. So for example, if you were doing a black and white, you're working in Photoshop on something and you decided you wanted to do black and white through Silver Effects Pro because you have a favorite thing in Silver Effects Pro, you could bring that filter in, you'd work on it in Silver Effects, it would bring it back as a new layer. And then you could adjust the opacity of the Silver Effects layer up and down to show maybe it's a little too much or a little too little. Same with like Nik Vivisa. I know Sharon Tenenbaum will often go into Vivisa and make adjustments, bring it back into Photoshop as a separate layer, and then she'll say, oh, I think I went too far. Then you just reduce the opacity. And it's so adjustable. I wasn't kidding, folks, when I said at the beginning, you could spend the rest of your life learning Photoshop. One of the advantages of some of the other programs I mentioned is that they are far less complicated. So if this is like, whoa, too much for me, try something like On One. Most of these programs have free 30-day trials. So On One is how I got started in layered work. Luminar, somebody in my SIG uses Luminar. So any of those ones that I mentioned, other than Photoshop Elements, because Photoshop Elements is 8-bit only, but the other ones I mentioned, if you took a screenshot or whatever, those would work too, and would be less intimidating. And they all have pretty decent tutorials online. But of course, as I said at the beginning, Photoshop was made 34 years ago, and it was made for everybody, graphic designers, everybody, not specifically for photographers. And yet there's nothing more powerful out there that I know of. So thank you for coming. We're not going to do part 2 because I've run out of knowledge. If I learn more and I think you might enjoy it, then I'll let you know. But I'm glad you're able to join me tonight, and I hope it's made things a little clearer.
It was very helpful. Thank you so much.
Have a good night and stay cool.
Yeah.
Yes, bye-bye.
Bye,
Thanks very
everybody.
much.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Judy.